In the summer of 1977, Camp Scott sat secluded in the dense, rugged wilderness of eastern Oklahoma. The property stretched across 400 acres of thick forest, intentionally isolated from the noise and light of the outside world. For the arriving campers, that isolation was the entire appeal. Among the dozens of girls stepping off the buses were 8-year-old Lori, 9-year-old Michelle, and 10-year-old Denise. The three girls had never met, but they were assigned to share tent number 8 in a unit called Kiowa, tucked far back into the tree line. When night fell, the camp plunged into absolute darkness. Without streetlights or city glow, visibility essentially dropped to zero. In those early morning hours, counselors and nearby campers heard faint, troubling noises, a low moan, a brief scream, and a flashlight sweeping across a tent flap. But in the confusing, pitch-black environment of a children's summer camp, people often wake up crying or disoriented. The sounds were dismissed, and everyone went back to sleep. The next morning, a counselor walking toward the showers noticed a sleeping bag discarded off the trail. Inside were the bodies of Lori, Michelle, and Denise. They had been violently attacked inside their tent while they slept, then carried out into the woods. The camp immediately descended into sheer panic as authorities locked down the property. Investigators quickly zeroed in on a 33-year-old local fugitive named Leroy Hart. He had previously been convicted of violent assaults and escaped prison twice. By 1977, he had been living off the grid in these exact woods for 4 years. Finding him became an obsession. Law enforcement agencies launched one of the largest manhunts in Oklahoma history, sending armed search teams and tracking dogs deep into the Cookson Hills to pull Hart out of the brush. The state captured him, charged him, and brought him to trial, backed by a massive collection of physical evidence recovered from the woods. Yet, when the case finally went to the jury in 1979, they deliberated for roughly 30 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty. To understand how a man with that profile walked free, we have to look at exactly what investigators found at the camp, and why it wasn't enough. The warning signs had actually started months before the murders. During a staff training weekend in April, someone broke into a counselor's cabin and left a handwritten note stuffed inside a donut box, threatening to kill 3 campers in a tent. Nearby, a crude effigy was found hanging from a tree by a noose. At the time, the camp directors wrote it off as a bizarre prank. Looking at a map of the crime scene, you can see exactly how investigators tracked the killer's movements. After the attack, the perpetrator left a size 9.5 footprint in the dirt. Moving roughly 150 yards away from tent 8, they dropped a large red flashlight. To dim the beam and stop the internal batteries from rattling, the killer had packed the inside of the flashlight with a specific torn newspaper and covered the lens with duct tape. Investigators followed that physical trail to a small cave about 3 miles away. Inside, they found a makeshift shelter stocked with groceries, a roll of duct tape matching the tape on the flashlight, and newspapers that perfectly matched the torn scraps packed inside the battery compartment. On the cave wall, someone had written, "The killer was here. Bye-bye, fools." The cave was a survivalist's den, consistent with a man who had spent 4 years hiding from the law by living entirely off the land. To the detectives, the sequence of events was obvious, but in the criminal justice system, a compelling narrative built on connecting artifacts is not the same thing as undeniable proof. By the time the trial began in 1979, the case had become a national media spectacle. Leroy Hart walked into the courtroom wearing a crisp suit, projecting a calm demeanor that completely contradicted the violent monster the prosecution described. His defense team didn't try to explain away the evidence. Instead, they attacked the investigation's scientific integrity. In 1977, forensic biology was heavily reliant on visual comparisons. Technicians could look at a hair sample under a microscope and declare that its structure looked consistent with the suspect's hair. What they could not do was extract a unique genetic profile to say with absolute certainty that it belonged to one specific human being. The defense capitalized on this gap. They pointed out that there was no direct biological evidence, no definitively matched blood, sweat, or skin cells that explicitly proved Hart was physically inside Tent 8 while the attack occurred. Because the science couldn't provide absolute certainty, the defense introduced an alternative theory. Local police, embarrassed by their failure to capture Hart for 4 years, had planted his belongings in that cave to frame him. By weaponizing the technological limits of 1970s forensics, the defense successfully created reasonable doubt, resulting in that rapid acquittal. Despite beating the murder charges, Hart was still sent back to prison to serve out the remaining 300 years of his previous sentences. Just 2 months later, he collapsed in the prison yard and died of a massive heart attack at age 35, seemingly taking the truth of what happened at Camp Scott with him. The physical evidence sat in storage until 1989, when early DNA testing methods were finally applied to the case, but the science was still in its infancy. The results show that the biological material found at the scene belonged to a small percentage of the population that included Hart, but the statistical match was still too weak to draw a definitive conclusion. It took another 3 decades for technology to close the gap. In 2022, investigators took the exact same heavily degraded biological samples collected from the woods in 1977 and subjected them to modern DNA sequencing. As we map out the results from the modern testing, you can see how the new technology systematically eliminated the alternatives. By comparing the recovered DNA against the profiles of everyone ever suspected of the crime, the laboratory ruled them out one by one. By the end of the test, only one individual could not be excluded as the source of the evidence: Leroy Hart. The biological traces and discarded items left in the Oklahoma woods were always telling the truth. The recovered flashlight, the torn duct tape, and the hair samples all pointed to the exact same conclusion in 1977 as they do today. It simply took 45 years for forensic science to evolve enough to read them clearly.